Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Elisha. I am a doctor of computer science, and welcome to Perspectives with Elisha, my podcast. In this episode, I was fortunate enough to grab Brianna Wu, whom you may know, for a talk about progressivism, Israel, and many topics at the intersection of these two. This conversation took place at the early days of September, about 2.5 weeks ago, which is an important piece of information considering how fast things change around here in Israel. Anyway, before we continue to our discussion, a few short comments are in order. First of all, this episode was two firsts for me. It was the first episode I conducted in English, and also it was my first video interview. Usually, my podcast is audio only. As such, you might notice that there are a few rough edges in the final product, specifically with the lighting on my end and the positioning of the video, so my apologies, and I hope to do better next time. Second of all, there are two mistakes that I made in the discussion, which I'd like to correct here. First of all, at some point in the discussion, I specified that Israel had 8 million citizens, whereas it's closer to 10. So 10 million is a better approximation for how many citizens Israel has nowadays. And also, I attributed a certain article to Bret Stephens, which was in fact written by Matt Friedman. I believe those are the only two glaring errors I made, and of course, if you find any others, feel free to reach out and let me know. So, I hope you enjoy the episode, and of course, feel free to reach out for comments, for questions, and I'll try to respond. And with that, let's move on to the episode. Hello, everyone, and welcome to my podcast. At the moment, this is the first time I'm doing an English podcast, so until now, my podcast has been purely Hebrew. So this is really like a new moment. And the reason I'm mentioning that is because I haven't actually decided what this podcast will be called yet. So you'll find out in the final version when I put out with like a nice opening screen and everything. Anyway, we are here to talk with Brianna Wu. And there she is. And she's the executive director of Rebellion PAC and a former candidate to the U.S. House of Representatives in Massachusetts, right? I'm getting that correctly?
That's it. Glorious District 8.
Okay, cool. And we'll get right down to the discussion in a moment. But since many of you may not know who I am, so I figure I should give like a short introduction. So very briefly, my name is Dr. Elisha Rosenzweig. I was born in Israel to American parents, and I've lived in Israel most of my life. I had a 4-year stint in UMass Amherst, where I did my PhD in computer science between 2007 and 2011. Married, 4 kids, 1 dog, and I'm an Orthodox Jew. Okay, so you'll see this yarmulke peeping over here every so often. And about a year ago, after October 7th, I started my podcast, in which I try to analyze deep topics surrounding us from multiple angles. And until today, as I mentioned, the podcast has been totally in Hebrew, and now we're debuting the English version. So, Brianna, thank you for being the first one to dip your feet in those waters. Welcome.
Thank you for inviting me. You could have held it in Hebrew, but I don't know how good a conversation it would have been.
With all the AI out there today, you never know what you can do.
So I've got to ask, what was your computer science specialty? Because my professional expertise was in graphic engines and C++ and game dev engines.
Yeah, you and I actually, I think, were born in the same year, right? I think you're
1977.
Yeah, so we have the same birth year. And so I keep on wondering, because I know you were in Massachusetts, and that's where you lived, I believe, at some point, right? That's where you ran for.
But I grew up in Mississippi, and I have to tell you, it was very difficult getting a computer science education in Mississippi in the 80s and 90s. And you can appreciate this, how deprecated Turbo Pascal 4 was by 1996. But that was the only thing I could learn to program on. When I went to university for engineering my first year, we were learning Fortran when C++ was like the really big new hot things. I actually had to learn object-oriented programming. I had to go get books at Barnes and Nobles and teach it all to myself. It was a hot mess.
Wow, wow. So I will have done everything a little bit behind you because in Israel we have 3 year of mandatory army,
Oh,
and I also
wow.
did additional like a study like religious studies. So overall, I started my university, my first degree at 24 when I was 24. So I came a little bit later, and we already had Java. So that was already so much more easy to do. Like
Easy, but yeah, are you picking up some good habits if Java is your first language? I don't know.
look, I can tell you that when we did in my we started with Java, and then we had garbage collection, which was a lot of fun. And then you had to learn C later in the degree, and that was really really painful because once you got
Yes.
used to not having to manage memory, it was to move on to a language where you have to manage memory was really really crazy.
Oh my goodness.
So anyway, so yes, I was there, and I keep on wondering a little bit, if you and I maybe, went to the same grocery store at some point while I was doing my PhD, because, or maybe I cut you off at some highway at some point. But
It's
putting that
Boston.
aside,
Odds are good. Odds are good for Boston. Yes.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, I was in Amherst, so it wasn't really in Boston, so
Fair,
but who
fair.
knows?
I
Yeah,
get
exactly.
around though. I get around.
Right. Yeah. So anyway, here we are, and I'll give a little bit of background about what we're doing here. So as I mentioned, I started this podcast right after October 7th, and I had for the past decade or so been watching from Israel a lot of what was going on in the university campuses
Yeah.
and the progressive movement in general, not from a Jewish standpoint, just from a cultural interest standpoint. I stumbled across a video in 2014 about safe spaces, didn't
Hmm.
know what it was, started going down the rabbit hole, and then, found myself with this huge treasure trove of information about progressivism and having nothing to do with it because my wife got sick of me talking about it. And I was starting to think about doing a podcast, and that's when October 7th hit. And I remember that like people in Israel were really shocked. People in Israel, especially on the left, were shocked to see the reaction of multiple factions of the progressive movement. And so I went ahead and I made this like I was like a man on a mission, put out an episode once a week for 27 weeks, and got out my first season of my podcast all about progressivism, some of its foundations, some of its cultural expression, trying to explore it. The purpose of the podcast was to understand it, meaning I wasn't coming to do like a gotcha. It wasn't designed to be like an attack dog. It was designed to say, okay, what are the foundations? How do people reach these conclusions? Maybe I don't agree with them, but that's not the point. The point is to understand. And so that
Sure.
was the whole concept of the podcast. And so, here we are. Somebody wrote to me like a few weeks ago and said, Elisha, it's really nice this podcast you did, but why don't you ever host, why don't you ever interview somebody who was a progressive? And I was, hey, I've been following Brianna on Twitter, so maybe we should talk. Yeah, and that's how this came about. So I really wanted to talk about, what your take is on the progressive movement in general. I'm interested to hear. Maybe we should start at the beginning. When did you know that you were a progressive, and how did that
Well,
happen?
I think for anyone that grows up, queer, kind of more leftist politics, obviously, have their allure, right? I grew up in Mississippi, queer in the 80s and 90s, so it was a very,
Mm,
very difficult place to grow up. There wasn't really help for kids like me, so I think that, anyone in that situation, there's a lot of temptation to fall into, I don't want to say extreme politics, but, ideas like racial equality for everyone and, like you said, transgender equality, things like that are very, very tempting, as is universal health care. When my family disowned me when I came out, I went many, 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 many years without having any health care whatsoever.
So when you
Um,
say
sure,
just a quick step back, when you say your family disowned you,
they did.
when did you come out? Like how old were you?
Oh gosh, I think I was like 24. So,
Wow.
I'd actually gone to rehab. My life was just a mess being in the closet, and yeah, I was doing every drug I could get my hands on, trying to, you know, basically pretend to be something I wasn't. And, I got my life together and, came out, and my parents couldn't do that. And I found out I was homeless not long after that, which was it was a very difficult part of my life. But, the way that ties to progressivism is you can't go through that kind of extreme poverty, much less grow up in a place like Mississippi that is still, suffering from the legacy of slavery and not have things like, structural solutions for racial inequality to feel like the right policy. And I want to be really clear, like I do in America generally think that both political parties are more interested in themselves than taking care of business for working people. So I still believe in that, but I've as I think you've seen, I've had a really public and hardcore breakup with progressivism since October 7th.
Yeah.
It's just going in some directions that I think are evil, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, yeah. So we're gonna talk about that in just a moment. So when you were 24, that was sort of when you came out. That was when your parents disowned you, and then a bit down the line from there, or around that time, you sort of began to identify like as
Hmm.
progressive. I
Sure.
mean, by 18 you're voting, so obviously you're already asking yourself like, what do you believe in, and that's where you find yourself. And then when did you see politics as your like goal? I mean, I know you're like
Sure.
that's what you do for a job. How did that happen?
Well, when I was in school, it was for journalism, and that's how I wanted to make a difference. So I've always been interested in politics. Also with the Iraq War and Bush, I was extremely, extremely against that war. I think it is fair to say that the decision of Bush to invade Iraq and, try to get imaginary weapons of mass destruction, I think that has directly created the situation that you are dealing with in Israel right now. So, I was very, very against that war. But, time moves on, and eventually I did want health insurance, and I went and got a job in engineering and, did some fun things with my career. So, but I've always been interested in politics. I was actually working in DC for a bit around 9/11, which really disillusioned me with the Republican Party in this country.
Really? What about 9/11? 9/11 itself, like you were there
Yeah,
when 9/11 happened, and
yeah, I
that was
was. I was. It was seeing the way the Republican Party was reaching conclusions that we did not really have evidence for. I understood, like, Afghanistan at least. I think that's a legitimate mission objective. They're letting Osama bin Laden escape into the mountains of Tora Bora and,
yeah.
helping, what was it, the families of, the Saudi hijackers get on a plane and leave on 9/11. That gives me some questions. But overall, I could at least understand that mission objective. America was attacked and we needed to do something about it. Iraq, just top to bottom, was there's no evidence for it.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to say that I regret standing up against that war because I do think it was a bad war. But I also think that my understanding of national security was not as sophisticated back then because I hadn't worked in politics for 20 years and, had friends that work in NatSec and like just I had a very younger vision of the world, if that makes sense to you.
Oh, for sure, for sure. I mean, I have this like I tend to write these diaries to myself along the years, and every so often I take a look at these old diaries that I had when I was younger, and it's really interesting to see how I forget. It's also interesting how I forget. Like I forget how simply how simplistically I viewed the world.
That's right.
Yeah, when you're younger, things seem very black and white and clear cut, and by now, I think of myself now, and I look at the media, and it's so easy for me to filter out so much of the noise because I understand so much more of what's pumping all this information into the system.
That's right.
When you're younger, you look at them and you're saying, how can somebody say that if it's not true? And it has to be true. So
Well, I also, and I hope this doesn't come across as defending Bush, which I want to be very clear, I'm not going
sure,
to.
Yeah.
But I think that I'm not the only American that learned the wrong lessons from those years, which is the fight against Islamic extremism is evil itself, and that
Yeah.
America, any effort that we do to take on that is destined to fail. I think I really took the wrong lesson from that for a long time. And, frankly, it wasn't until October 7th and, really digging very deeply into the state of the Middle East and the destabilization that's going on. It's not that I'm saying invading Iraq was the correct policy, because it was not, but I think we were right to want to be involved in that side of the world more after 9/11, and to take a more proactive, stance to dealing with that. The problem, in my view, is the Bush administration was entirely incapable of doing that with any sophistication.
Yeah, yeah. Maybe we'll get to a little bit about the way that the right and the left play things out in Israel. We have something similar, I think, going on here, but we'll see if we get to that. Before we talk about some internal Israeli politics, let's first of all get to October 7th for a moment. So if I would have met you at the eve of October 7th, if I would have, been around in the grocery shop, in Massachusetts, right? And I would have met you on October 6th. And I would have asked you what you thought about Israel, about the Israeli conflict with Gaza, with the Palestinian Authority. What would you have told me on October 6th?
Told you that I thought it was really unfair that American Jews were blamed for Netanyahu's actions.
Hmm.
And if we were really good friends, I would have told you that I was kind of privately disturbed by the anti-Semitism that I saw growing in my own ranks. But
Hmm.
I've always believed Israel has a right to exist. And I think you would have seen me as someone very, very pro Israel in general.
Got it. So then October 7th happens, and what changes?
Um, I was looking at Twitter and feeling like I'd lost my goddamn mind. Um, I remember the first thing I saw, it was of a paraglider going into a music festival, and someone saying, "Finally, liberation is coming." And I'm like, what the fuck? Like, that's an AK-47 they're holding? Like, that's a that's a terrorist. What the fuck are you talking about? And I'm just scrolling, and I'm watching friends, people that I thought I was on the same side of, cheer for this slaughter that's going on. And I'm sitting there, and it's literally this phone right here, and I'm just scrolling, and I feel like I'm taking my crazy pills. Like, there's this one video, and I don't know what day this came out, but it says this young terrified woman, and she's in the back of a car, and her pelvic area is covered by blood, and she's being escorted around with some Islamists, and they're getting her into the front seat, and it's so apparent that she's been raped. They're kidnapping her, and I'm reading the comments. It's people I know, people I've sat down, I've had dinner with, people I've worked with on political campaigns, saying shit like, "Well, she wasn't raped. Like, how can you know this is just liberation?" And I'm trying to figure out, like, not that's about me, but I'm trying to figure out what the fuck I'm going to do. To just jump back in time 10 years, the way I became kind of a national figure in our country is
Right.
there's this event called Gamergate, which was a harassment campaign against women in the video game industry. I was one of them. I got a lot of rape threats, I got a lot of death threats. There's a Law and Order episode about it, a few TV shows, a whole bunch of media. It was a really, really bad time. And, I spoke my mind in that time period, and I'm very proud of that. So you fast forward 10 years, and yeah, I know on some level that there's this anti-Semitic cancer that's eating apart the progressive movement that I've just looked the other way on. And it's at a point where I can't look the other way. And seeing people like cheer for the destruction of Israel and the slaughter of civilians and the sexual assault of women. And I'm like, I thought we were feminists. I thought we were against rape.
Right.
Um, and I'm just trying to figure out what to do. I'm sorry if that's long-winded, but
No,
it
no.
was very difficult, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Um, it's interesting. I remember one of your posts later in the war where you were talking about um, some of the egregious things that were coming out of the UN, and you
Yeah.
were saying that I forget if you were just now if you were realizing it now or if you
Yeah.
were retroactively. You said something along the lines of, "I'm hearing from all sorts of like Jewish people or Israeli people that, or I can tell that they're relatively impervious to the criticism from the UN,
Yeah.
and that you're starting to understand why." In
Yeah.
other words, the realization that people in Israel see the amount of injustice that the UN puts out all the time, and we're used to the fact that sure, like the world hates us. People are used to it. It's part of our culture. And like how did we survive? Right there's this joke about Jews that we say like that most of our holidays are can be summed up in 10 words. They tried to kill us, we won. Now let's eat. That's sort of like the classic Jewish holiday.
I
And
like that. I like
yeah,
that.
but it's like it's so ingrained in our DNA to some degree to know that these moments are going to come in history. And whereas I think we were all shocked, obviously, and shocked by the response, but it sort of fit into a narrative that we more or less know about. Yeah. And to see you sort of realize that and go through that in different stages has been, again, it's weird. See, right? The woke movement calls itself that way because you've woken up, right? You
Yeah.
understand the world differently because you've woken up and you see the world for what it's really like. And but so we can use that phrase and that concept without necessarily referencing the woke movement.
Sure.
Seeing you wake up into something that I, let's say, grew up with, from the moment I was born.
Yeah.
It's I felt I to some degree like I was there's both a sense of um, um, I'm happy that people are understanding reality, but
Yeah.
also there's an element of I feel bad for people that they have to wake up and understand the reality. Like why did we have to get to that point where that is the reality?
Well, I would say, for me, my support of the UN, I think is, generally speaking, it was rooted in good intentions, right? Like, what is the difference between Iraq War One and Iraq War Two, right? With
Hmm.
Iraq War One, we put together a coalition of people to go solve a problem like invading Kuwait. It was an international effort, it was massively successful, and we had a plan to win the peace. The problem with Iraq War Two was our coalitions were a joke. America went it alone. So as someone like, I'm very, very, very pro NATO. I'm very
Hmm.
pro international alliances, which is why I'm so pro like America having a close relationship with Israel. So
Hmm.
to me, you think about that, it's like, of course, the UN is great. We can solve problems there. We can address genocides. We can work with
Right.
other countries. We can talk through problems. We can, send humanitarian aid instead of going to war, right?
Right.
This seems great. So you're operating from this paradigm that the UN is good,
Yeah.
but you start digging into the way that Israel is treated, and it's just indefensible. And it makes a lot of sense. You've got 400 million Muslims in that area. What is it, 27 different countries? And then just Israel, 7 million Jews, 2 million non
Right.
Jews, right? So it makes sense why it's held to these double, triple, quadruple standards, but it's not something you're asked to think about as an American. Does that make sense to you?
Oh, for sure. I think the thing that's interesting about the UN, and it sort of, I think, also projects on similar things that you see within, let's say, what happened to the university campuses, though it's of course a different dynamic, is that the UN is an institution, and it was built upon a foundation, which I think the foundation was what you described,
Yeah.
meaning the United States led this idea in post World War II. The League of Nations had crumbled, so they were looking for a new way to coordinate, efforts in order to prevent, future wars and facilitate, collaboration and all that stuff. And that's all great. And the problem is that when you have an institution, so institutions have, they become codified in certain rules. And then if you know how to leverage the rules, right, you can start, polluting the original ideal if you treat the rules just as a mechanic, right? If it's not, rules are like you're trying to square the circle. You're trying to, to find a way to capture an idea within rules. I mean, you could see that a lot, let's say, with, also within the progressive movement, with a lot of the, attempts at, let's say, at preventing trigger warnings and microaggressions. Microaggressions is a very cool it's a very clear case of that. Microaggressions are a case where you're trying to create this more sterile kind of conversation environment. Everybody should feel comfortable. But if you overregulate it, it starts to pollute, the idea of free speech and other things too.
Sure.
And so in the UN, as long as the main drive was let's say the spirit of the UN, which probably was true in the earlier years, I hope, right? There was more room for the spirit to prevail. But when you go down to just mechanical techniques, so, in the UN, the only force that exists to some degree is the veto rule in the Security Council. So as long as the US is staunchly supporting Israel, we're protected. But that's the only real limit there is to majority voting in the UN that I know of, right? And then that's how you get to a situation where the most egregious thing about the UN is that, as I'm sure by now you know, the UN Human Rights Council, I think, is led today either by Syria or by Iran or something, right?
It's hilarious if you think about it.
Yeah, exactly. And then you can redefine everything. You can redefine what human rights means and what dignity means and what all those things mean. And then, hey, the entire world, can flip on its head, and it's all by the rules. It's all by the books.
I don't even, another thing I've really had my woke moment of after October 7th is understanding a lot of these international aid groups and human rights organizations. Like, I'm sorry, like, there's obviously a need for humanitarian dollars to flow into, war-torn areas of the Middle East, right? Yemen is a great example. But it's also true that you cannot have this influx of humanitarian aid. Like, there's a tendency for that money to intersect with terrorism in certain ways and instability. So, like, I think part of my awakening is just kind of getting over a lot of this naivety that I had, and understanding some of these threats and honestly really sitting down and reading deeply. Something.
Have you read anything by Thomas Sowell?
I don't think I have yet. I've obviously
really
read his columns and stuff. But I think, like, here in the United States, there's no moment you're really asked to learn anything about Jewish history outside of the Holocaust, right? World War II. So when it comes to, the expulsions of Jews from so many countries, through history or like even, 1948, there's not really an impetus to sit down and read that very deeply, right? I can barely remember, Arafat and the peace deal falling apart when I was in college, and the assassination of Israel's prime minister, but I didn't really sit down and think through like connecting the dots of Hamas coming to power in 2005 and the withdrawal from Gaza, or the war in Lebanon before that. So it's like, I guess I'm saying is I think most Americans are just so woefully undereducated on this history that when this propaganda apparatus is out there to tell you Israel's the aggressor, Israel, has been stealing Palestine, it's easy to believe that. Because the alternative of that is going, oh, okay, why did Israel withdraw from Gaza, back then? Okay, why did Hamas get elected? Okay, why did the peace deal fall apart? Okay, why was there, and you keep going back and back and back to 1948. It's fascinating history. It's really rewarding to learn, but it's also like a lot, if that makes sense.
Yeah, we're an intense country. Things are happening here all the time.
Yeah.
You were talking about how people are not very aware of the way of what happens in Israel, the history. They don't have like an awareness of, what we've been going through here. Um, Israelis are convinced that the entire world is talking about them all the time because relative to our size, we do get disproportionate amount of news coverage all the
Sure.
time. This has been actually like researched like about, I think 15 years ago or 10 years ago. Brett Stevens, I think he put out an article at the time where he basically showed like how many news organizations per capita there are in Israel, at any given time, with people going around looking for news stories. There's so much coverage of what's going on over here, way more than there would be anywhere else. And one of the reasons is because if you want to cover an area where there's a dispute, a war, right? But also be able to go and eat, in a normal cafe, that's Israel, right? You're not going to go to Syria because you're in Syria. There's, it's a real war zone. It's a civil war going on all the time. You can get really hurt, and there's nowhere for you to feel comfortable. In Israel, you can sit in Tel Aviv, half the day, then drive down to the Palestinian Authority, take some pictures there, come back, and you're fine. It's very easy to some degree. Beyond, of course, there could also be, of course, elements of anti-Semitism, etc. But it was a really, really good article. I'm not sure if I can find the link, but if I do, I'll send it to you afterwards.
Please do. I mean, don't you
Yeah.
think part of it too is, I'm not Jewish and Presbyterian, but so much of like my religion's like history took place there, like
Oh, for sure.
it's really
Yeah.
interesting to like, to read about this war and to look at maps and to then think about various parts of the Bible that
Oh,
that
yeah,
took
yeah.
place there.
I think
So
there's
I
a
don't
lot of good
know.
reasons. I
Yeah.
mean, Israel is located geographically at the crossroads between Africa in the south.
That's
We
right.
have Asia in the north and Europe.
Egypt. Yeah.
Okay, Egypt. So I'm saying like continentally, we're in the crossroads.
That's
Okay,
right.
and so that means that there's a lot of geopolitics that has happened here over the ages, and a lot of different people see themselves as having a stake in what goes on here. And
Yeah.
even if you put aside religious reasons, like if you believe that that there's if you believe that it's not a coincidence that God's chosen people, let's say as a religious Jew, right, would also be the ones facing the most difficult trials. Even if you put that aside, just because of the history, like you said, Christians were here, Muslims were here, Jews were here, and geopolitically, it's an important spot. You think about like when oil was the big rage. So one of the ways that Israel was called by Americans was like the least expensive aircraft carrier, right? You can land as many airplanes as you want here if America needs to launch an attack somewhere, right? So it's free. We're just here if you want us. So there's a lot of reasons why Israel plays into a lot of this stuff.
Sure.
So anyway, so it is really difficult sometimes when you are trying to one of the things about living in Israel is that you're living very close to, let's call it, reality. Meaning we can't afford to make big mistakes. When we make big mistakes, October 7th happens.
Yeah.
Okay, in other words, we have very little geographic room to maneuver. It's a small country. We don't have a lot of, like strategic depth physically. Like, there's nowhere, in America, if somebody conquered, New York, you'd have where to go, right? In Israel, there's very little room to
That's right.
maneuver.
That's right.
And also, people around us really want to kill us all the
That's right.
time. And so when you
Well, I
grow up
guess
in that,
this comes to where I would love to ask you a couple of questions. Like
yeah,
I feel like America, like I'm a Democrat, but at
hmm
the same time, I have to tell you that I've been tremendously disappointed with Biden and the his willingness to stand with Israel in this time. And not
yeah,
even with words on TV, screw that. I'm saying just hardcore give you guys what you need.
yeah.
Is because of that sentiment you just explained where Israel cannot afford to make mistakes, do you feel like you can still count on my country to be a partner for you? Because if you don't, that's a really big political problem that we need to deal with.
Yeah. So obviously, there's about 8 million citizens in Israel, so I'm not going to be able to speak for everyone. And obviously, there's difference of, there's also right and left here. So there will
Sure.
be people from different persuasions will believe different things. I'll tell you how I see it. Um, Let me think how to put it. Um, I'll take a step back and I'll tell you a little bit what's been going on here, let's say culturally, politically, as a result of October 7th, and that will lead into an answer to your question. So, October 7th was a blow to both sides of the political aisle, but it's a very different kind of blow to the right and to the left. It was a blow to the right because there's a right-wing government. It's the most, let's say, extreme right government that we've had. I'm not using the word extreme, judgmentally, just, descriptively. Like it has the most, it's the most unanimously right-wing government that we've had in maybe forever. Okay, usually in Israel there'll be some mix because it's a coalitional approach, right? So
Sure.
to form a coalition, you'll usually take more like the center parties, and for all sorts of reasons, which we can talk about a little bit, that has sort of fractured over the past few years, leading to a very strong bifurcation between the right and the left. And so you have this, government that's only right wing. And so the fact that under a right wing government, which usually prides itself with focus on security, similar to what Trump, let's say, would project, let's say more, right? Strong security, strong borders, all that stuff. Um, Given that that was the government, and specifically Bibi Netanyahu has been around forever, and projecting, at least his persona, the way that he likes to present himself as being, very very hard on like very strong in security. The fact that that whole system failed, right? That the political system, the political leadership, was not able to function. That failed. That was a huge blow to the prestige and to the belief in those right wing leaders. So on the right wing side, it's mainly a sense of our leaders are, we're incompetent, let's say, in,
Sure.
furthering the things that we think that they should have done. And this, I think, also aligns with what you were saying earlier about Bush, that you felt that the Bush administration was really not effective at how they, even if directionally they had like a good instinct as to what had to happen, they had no way, they didn't know how to execute it in any way that had effective results, right?
That's
And
right.
that's sort of like the feeling here. But on the left, what's been happening is that, and you can really see it, it's almost a predictable cycle. There was a huge blow to the ideology. Okay, if you have to think about what happened here on October 7th, so who was hurt the most by October 7th in the immediate moments of October 7th? I'm not talking about the whole country. I'm not
Sure.
talking about economically. The people that were on the border, right, were two groups. There's a few cities which are, let's say right wingers, but most of the small communities, the kibbutzim, those are left leaning. The kibbutzim are these, more like socialist inspired, towns, and those were people that would, in their own, in their own spare time, they would cross the border to the Palestinian Authority and drive kids to hospitals in Israel. Okay, these were the most staunch supporters of the idea of two states, of peace. They had, they would look for people from Gaza to come and work in their homes. Okay, they believed very, very sincerely that the way forward was as much coexistence as we can possibly foster. And a lot of them were very idealistic. And these were the guys that were murdered. These were the families that were murdered, that were taken hostage. Okay. Also the people, of course, in the Nova Festival. But remember, again, just generally directionally, of course, there were, also soldiers and everything. I'm just trying to give people, I'm talking here in the broadest sense possible, not in the individuals. Because it was done on a holiday, that means that the people at the festival there weren't that many religious people at the festival, because the religious people were going to be in the synagogue, right? And that means, and again, right and left here too, there'll be more people that are right wing people. The religious will be more right wing, right? So again, the people that were hurt the most directly in the immediate effects of October 7th were the people that were most in support of the two-state solution, and they saw the evil that is the terrible, horrible evil that is Hamas, face to face, up close. Okay, so for them, this has been, for a lot of them, this has completely destroyed their vision for the future.
Yeah.
Okay, for a very long time, the story that they had was, the that if we only had a better government, not a right-wing government, not Bibi Netanyahu, we could foster some agreement here, and there would be a chance for peace, and we could really fix this whole thing up. That completely crushed that, and now you have people that are trying to rebuild that vision against, at least in my mind, the facts on the ground. But most of them are still searching for what it means. And this gets back to your question. So when under those conditions, when the people who most were in favor, right, of peace agreements, see that the United States is not, fully supportive, but tried to hold us back, and then you also see things like there's an issue also of like of clarity of understanding. Like it's one thing to say, behind the guise of, you put a general in front of a camera and they say, well, we're considering all our options. That's one thing. When, let's say, Kamala Harris stands in front of a camera and says, I have looked at a map and there's nowhere to move people in Rafah. I mean, anybody who's here knows that that's not true. And also we proved that it's not true. So when you get the sense that people on the other side of the ocean aren't actually trying, either they're not putting in the effort to understand what's happening, or they are, but they're not presenting it, honestly. Either way, in order to achieve some sort of goal that we think, hurts us, that's very hard. It's very hard for people in Israel, and I think that again, the left on Israel is now split between those that are rethinking their position. Doesn't mean that they're right wing now, but they're not just not sure what they think exactly.
They're trying to figure the way forward. I mean, I've struggled a lot with this after October 7th in the sense that, being on the left and just being an American, egalitarianism is really baked into the United States DNA.
For
Right?
sure.
This idea that, if someone wants to be a Muslim, yeah, we should respect that. That's a personal decision, just like being a Jew, just
Right.
like being gay. Women should be, treated fairly. We're a very egalitarian country at our core. And I'm not saying we
Right.
don't have problems, but I'm saying at our best, that is a fundamental American idea. And something I've really just and completely honestly been struggling with after October 7th is seeing these. Well, first, it's been a really eye opening example of the danger of Islamist theocracy, which is just a cancer. I can't be like double sided about this. There's just no good side to this. It's
Right.
destabilizing. It hurts people. It oppresses women. It kills gay people. Kills Jews. Like it's just a bad ideology, top to bottom. So how do you, as an American, kind of square that circle? Because, like, I mean, here in Boston, I've got Muslim friends. I've got friends in media that are Muslim. I have friends in media that are Palestinian. Right? I
Hmm.
know they're good human beings,
Right.
but how do you separate that political project of believing someone should have the right to worship as they wish and be respected for that and not have that reflect on them with this fact that there does seem to be this tendency towards extremism at the worst that seems to be baked in, that is it's not just a threat to your country, it's a threat to my country, and I think it's a threat to Western stability, just to be honest. How,
Yeah.
I mean, do you see, like, can you understand it's a real struggle for me?
Oh, for sure. For sure. First of all, I think that America, as much as, as an Israeli, I would, of
Sure.
course, like, America to think that I'm their top priority. Of course, who doesn't want that, right? Who doesn't want to be the top priority of America, right? But I don't expect that. America has to do what's good for America. That's obviously what America should ask themselves and think about it. What I do believe is, uh, my sense is that we're in this point where I think that a little bit like what happened with the UN, America needs to sort of remember to create once again some sort of like shared foundation of morality, what's called like the Overton window, right? Like what is considered, normal and what are things that we will not accept. I could see a little bit of that battle going on now, sort of like in what you're doing and in what's happening in the Democratic Party, right? You have people that are trying to, let's say, like some of the, the primary, battles that were going on now in the Democratic Party, like, so are people in the squad from the squad, are they part of the Democratic Party or not, right? That's sort of part of the decision that's happening inside, right? It's the internal question that the American people have to decide, for themselves, and each party has to decide for themselves.
Right.
What are the boundaries of what we consider to be okay? And you can be Muslim, that's okay. But if you adopt, let's say, the Muslim approach, again, there are multiple approaches in Islam, but if you adopt a more um, um, a fundamentalist view of Islam, in which you say, that there is no such thing as separation of church and
Church
state,
and state.
right?
Yeah.
Which is very common in Islam, that there's no separation. That's not that's the standard of Islam, is to assume that the two are fused together. So if you're going to push that as a norm, right? Then there has to be a point in which the parties say, look, that's not us. You want to run under that banner? Go ahead. But
That's right.
that's not going to be us. And I think part of the problem is that America and the West in general, and very, very broadly, what's happened in the West is that we have, we've adopted this approach, which you talked about, very egalitarian, very open, trying to say, look, everybody should navigate their life as much as possible according to what they believe, which is wonderful. The only problem is that doesn't mean that there aren't better ways to live and worse ways to live, and that we should, try to figure out what made the West so good,
Yeah.
and those things we can't destabilize.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of times this argument about, let's say, about religion. Should we look at the old laws and religion as just scaffolding that led us to where we are, and now we can get rid of it, because these rules of, these religious laws, etc., are not important anymore? Or are these not scaffolding? These are actually the foundations. And if we shake them, the whole system is going to shake. And I know we don't always know what the answer is, right? Some things in religion probably evolved, and we don't need them anymore, and some of them we need to keep. But I think we've forgotten a little bit the importance of keeping those things. And maybe I'll say one last thing about that.
Sure.
This is actually, I think, where the biggest problem of the divide between liberals and conservatives, or progressives and conservatives, even, is showing its effects. Because, see, like, so I myself, by nature, like my personality is more like of a liberal. Okay, I tend to
Sure.
be very open, into, etc. But my wife, she's a conservative. Okay, by her nature. I'm not saying what we vote, just in her character, she's a conservative. One of the things that conservatives know how to do that people that are liberal don't know how to do very well is to say no.
Yeah.
And then when you say no, there doesn't have to be a reason. No, because it's just because that's how we've done things until now. We're not changing that anymore. And to hold their ground on that very, very staunch, very dogmatic no. It's just the way things are. My wife is fine with that because she's conservative. But why? Wait a second. Why can't we change it? And then we'll have this argument which stems from these two different ways of looking at life. I think that what's part of it, what I think has happened to the progressive movement, is because, for all the reasons we all know about social media, etc., we've pulled apart so much that left and right don't talk anymore, and it's very hard to work across the aisle, stuff like that. The left has lost that, that thing that's ingrained in the conservative DNA of saying, look, we're not going past this point, and I can't explain to you why. I just know that we're not going past here. This is no
Well, I
more.
think in a democracy, you should be able to explain your reasons why, but fortunately, I can't. And, for me, a hard line with radical, Islam is when our campuses are being disrupted and kids can't go to school because they're taking over buildings. That's a hard line. In Dearborn, Michigan, and this is going to get me in trouble for saying, but it's how I truly feel. We have an all Muslim city council there, and they decide to ban gay people and gay flags from
Right, I heard.
existence.
Yeah.
It's not that I think that's the biggest public policy battle, but I think a reasonable person can look at that and go, huh. they're probably not really that interested in their queer constituents, right?
For sure, for sure.
And probably for religious reasons, right?
Yeah. So
So,
have you heard about, do you know about Chesterton's fence?
no, I don't know this.
So Chesterton's fence, it's a famous, I think, like parable by Chesterton, I think, where he said when you come across a fence, okay, and do you ask yourself, there's two ways of looking at that fence. One approach can be to say, look, I'm looking across the fence. I don't see anything dangerous there. I guess I can take it away.
Yeah,
And the other approach is say, well, if somebody put it here, then I guess there's a reason why it's here. I'm not going to move it.
there we
And
go.
that's the difference, the one of the intuitional differences between conservatives and liberals. So
Yeah,
this is just to
culturally
clarify what I said
perspective. Yeah,
before. I think you have to be able to explain, as much as you can your position. But I think that the question is when there are things in our culture that are in place, rules, regulations, norms, the difference between the intuition of the liberal and the intuition of the conservative is the liberal is saying, look, when this fence is stopping us from improving the lives of all sorts of people, right? Let's say, think about, LGBT rights, right? So, there were all these norms limiting LGBT people, right, or communities, and by shifting the norms, we're going to be in a better place. We'll be in a more equitable place. People will have more rights, more be able to achieve more. And the right was saying, look, until now we've built society without changing these norms, so we're gonna press the brake because by instinct, it goes against what we know. That's the reflexive. I'm not saying that there weren't additional reasonings and arguments, etc. Of course there was, but that's the gut reaction. What is your first impulse when you see limitations?
that's
And
fair, but societies have to be able to evolve and change. I mean, I think a
I
big
agree. I
problem with
agree.
theocratic Islam is it's stuck in the 6th century and it will
A
not
hundred
move on.
percent. No, no, I
Yeah,
agree with you. I just to clarify the ending of what I'm trying to say.
yeah,
That's why I believe that that's why we need liberals and conservatives to talk,
sure.
because you need to have that dynamic where the liberals are saying, wait a second, guys, like, look at the pain we're causing people in the current system. If we change A, B, C, D, things could be better. And the conservatives will say, yeah, but what if you ruin something that works? And then those two discussions, that's the discussion we have to have.
I
And
agree.
when the communities pull apart, then you suddenly end up. This is what I'm saying is that when a progressive hears a Muslim saying, "But I want to do the things the way I know," there's very little holding the progressive in place and saying, maybe you should say no,
Yeah.
because their instinct is to say yes, to say, of course, I want to be open to all experiences.
Well, so I think this gets into the purity spiral, which I think is one of the core problems with progressive ideology. So for me, like look at my example. I got into progressive healthcare, progressive policy because I cared a lot about healthcare policy, and I wanted, I cared about equal rights, right?
Yeah,
Good impulses, right?
yeah,
But then you keep moving along the storyline for progressives, and you brought up trigger warnings. Yeah, I remember when these first start to get really hot and common in 2016.
yeah.
And I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, like, hold on a second. Like, I've been to rehab, I've done a lot of therapy, I've gotten over trauma. I am 100% certain it is not healthy for you to avoid things that are psychologically triggering you if you have a case of PTSD. You can't give that all the power. You need to work with a therapist. You can't hide from the world and expect the world to cater to your state of mind. This is
Right.
just, I have empathy for what you're talking about, but it's just nuts.
Yeah,
And there was a culture with that where if you said, I'm not so sure about this trigger warning stuff, you're kicked out. And then it just keeps getting crazier and crazier and crazier. So,
right.
like the trans debate, it used to be that some very small portion of people grew up, identified in a different gender, like have a long list of clinical criteria and would go to a doctor and would participate in a very stringent process, right? And they
Hmm.
would try to integrate. That's good. But it goes to today where you've got children that are thinking they could be non-binary and they're literally like thinking they need to go on testosterone, and their
Right.
school district is like facilitating gender changes.
Without telling their
and not
parents.
necessarily without the parents being
Yeah,
involved
yeah,
with this. So it's
yeah,
like this purity spiral where you start from good intentions, and
yep,
progressivism doesn't have any mechanism to put the brakes on. And I
right.
think that's what's happened to me, actually, is, I went along with a lot of this progressive stuff for a long time, but October 7th happened, and our Jew hate is so out of control that I feel like I have to say, hold on, I'm not comfortable with this. I'm not going in your direction. This is wrong. This is evil. And it's just like setting flames to every single friendship I have, it's been very difficult.
Right. So can you tell me more about that experience? So like I know that a lot of people that are very that were famously canceled, right, over the years, have this moment where they suddenly put on the brakes, they suddenly start to question, and then their entire friend circle, shifts. They lose a bunch of people, they gain new people, and it's very traumatic. So
Yeah.
tell me a little bit more about what that was for you.
It's pretty much the same thing. October 7th happened, and I started speaking out about that. I started speaking about structural issues I saw in the Democratic Party, particularly around national security,
Yeah.
and, on trans issues, right? And I think anyone that reads my Twitter can read I'm very strongly pro trans. I just think the movement itself has become far too extreme.
Yeah.
And it is, yeah, I've lost friendships. I've lost media opportunities. I get death threats very regularly nowadays.
Crazy.
It has affected it's had contracts closed for me that I would work with various elections. So, it's been really, really traumatic, to be honest with you.
Wow. When you're talking about losing friendships, these are people that you knew
Yeah.
in person,
Yeah,
like,
people I'm really good friends with and I've worked with on various initiatives. It's just been like setting fire to every bit of that. And it's painful. I don't have another way to say it.
for sure, for sure. And on the opposite side, have you been finding more people joining,
Sure.
and following you and then supporting you, etc.? Has that happened as well?
Oh yeah, I've definitely had that. I think the number of Jewish friends that I have has probably increased by a factor of 10, which I've really appreciated. But not just that, touching base with Republicans that, yeah,
Mm,
I'm not going to vote the same way in the election, but there's some good stuff that we agree on and we can work with. So I definitely appreciate that.
yeah.
It's just sometimes it gives me pause when they have ideas that are so contrary to things that are very important to me. So I guess I'd be honest and say I'm still trying to figure it all out.
Yeah, no, it's one of the things about America is that because it's so locked into the two-party system, whatever you vote for, you're voting for, a very gross approximation of what you really believe, right? You only have two choices, really. I mean, you can mix and match a bit, right? Because you can vote for the presidency and for the Senate and for the Congress. You can do a little bit of mixing, but it's still relatively rough as far as like level of precision you can have for your opinion
I
when
agree.
you're voting. Yeah, yeah. The um, so really, when you look at I mean, you're much closer to the Democratic Party than I am, or most people are. You look at the convention, you look at the protests outside the convention. I'm trying to gauge, is the Democratic Party being taken over? There are two extreme narratives. Okay, one option is that it's being taken over by extreme anti-Zionist, and the opposite approach is no. On the contrary, they're putting on the brakes. There's more voices like fighting back, and actually after the next election you'll see that things are more stable, etc. Where does it really stand?
So I do think there's an anti-Semitic cancer in the Democratic Party that we need to aggressively cut out, and I'm not interested in excusing that. I think it's generally on the more progressive side, and it's with some of the frankly, with some of the Muslim people that joined our party after 9/11. And I do think we need to aggressively do stuff about that. But as far as them having power, I'm not the only person that noticed that their attempt to turn, the DNC a few weeks ago into a repeat of the Chicago
Right.
riots, completely failed. So I think the thing that is going to really determine whether, this kind of anti-Semitic cancer has staying power in our party is going to be if Kamala Harris ends up winning. Free Palestine ends up sabotaging this entire movement.
Hmm.
I think the Democratic Party will take all the wrong lessons from that. I think they will
Really?
conclude we need to pull further away from Israel and we need to satiate these people. I think if she wins, she's going to take the opposite lesson that you actually can tell these people to go F themselves and, get to the business of running the country. So I hope it's that, but I will tell you, I get hundreds of messages from Democratic operatives, like thankful for me speaking up.
Mm-hmm.
They may not be as forward facing as I am, but they see these forces tearing the party apart.
Wow, that what you just now said was very interesting because there's also a lot of talk about how the fact that the Democratic Party wasn't, let's say, more uh, supportive of Israel in a clear way, that that's causing like a shaky Jewish vote,
Yeah,
right? So it's
right.
interesting that you're saying that you think that if they lose, that if the Democratic Party loses, that will actually teach them the lesson that they need to disengage from Israel even further.
As best as I can tell, there is almost no serious effort in the Democratic Party to rebuild our relationship with Jews,
Wow.
which is insane to me. I don't know why we don't see this gaping wound. I don't see why we don't understand that we're undermining some of our closest friends and our
Hmm.
biggest donors and our most loyal canvassers and phone bankers, but we don't, and it gives me a lot of pause. So I don't know what else to say other than I've been screaming this from the rooftops for months now. So
Yeah. But it's interesting because I think the leading opinion, I think, on the right in Israel is that if Trump doesn't win, we're going to have a very cold, like we're going to have a cold shoulder, let's say, from the White House.
I don't agree with that. I don't.
Interesting.
I'm not gonna tell you I've liked what Kamala has said on this. I don't. I mean, I'm not convinced that she has a true commitment to Israel from her
Hmm.
public comments.
Right?
And I'm also concerned about her foreign policy, which she has not kind of talked about in a way that I felt persuasive.
Yeah.
She has a real habit of defaulting to informationless cliches when she talks, which
Yeah.
severely undermines my confidence in her. I would say, like, this is the meta argument that I really would hope your listeners would think about,
Sure.
is it's not what one individual is going to do with the presidency. You have to think about the entire apparatus. And in my view, Donald Trump consistently undermined our entire national security apparatus by being entirely uninterested in the NSA, the CIA, being willing to abuse both of them for his own personal ends. Talking about dismantling NATO, I think he is entirely too cozy with Putin and dictators all around the world. So I think the thing I would say to assuage your right wing is say no matter how Kamala Harris feels, there's a national security establishment that will be run competently if she wins. And I think you can count on that. At the same time, it's not like my efforts and other people's efforts to kind of fix this perception of Israel in the
Hmm.
party. It's not like that stops on November 12th.
Right.
This is going to be a decade-long project, and
Hmm.
there's a lot of organized efforts to do that. So I think when you look at the totality of it, and especially at APAC's wins over Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman, kicking out two, I'm sorry, just blatant anti-Semites out of the
Yeah.
party, I think like a lot of Democrats are feeling like the band hammer's out for them if they keep this stuff up. So I think that's good.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's definitely very encouraging, and it's part of one of the it was sort of one of the reasons why I wanted us to talk because I think that it's very easy to look at other countries just like America looks at us. We look at America and we see everything in a much lower resolution.
Sure.
So it's much easier for us to to sort of paint things very, very in very stark colors. So why do you think that it didn't succeed? That the efforts to turn the DNC into a repeat of what happened in 1968, why didn't it succeed? Was it just because I know that there was like huge security laid out around the
Yep.
city, trying to like really control who could get into the DNC and not? Was it just that, or is it that the I guess what I'm trying to figure out is, we see all these marches and we see what's happening on campuses, but is it really a paper tiger? Like, the degree to which these more extreme factions are active in the Democratic Party and can have effect on them, is it really smaller than what it appears? Let's say,
Yeah.
or, yeah. So I'd be happy to hear more about that.
I think it's paper tiger, and I think it's smaller than it appears. There are people there. I think it's true that with younger people, they are more sympathetic to Palestinians, but you have to understand it's a puddle deep feeling, right?
Right.
And if we put efforts out there on TikTok and played the same game that the enemies of Israel did with the,
Yeah.
because they're
Yeah.
out there trying to propagandize young people and turn them against
Uh-huh.
both our countries, I think they're reachable. I think the reality is, go to a protest on my campus. That's the cool thing to do. Sure, I'll do that. Fly to Chicago and potentially get arrested for trying to create a riot. That's a different standard. And when it comes down to it, the Hamas apologists could not get bodies to fill a rally. It was very low protest numbers. So I think we really need to be aware of the efforts out there to inculcate people and to make them believe there's a bigger sentiment towards this than really exists.
Yeah. And I guess one last question. Do you have any specific takes on what's going to happen in the college campuses over the next month or two or three? I mean, studies are starting. Colleges have this time between semesters to get ready
Yeah.
and to, adjust their policies. Do you think that what we're going to see now, we're getting into the next phase of the election? This is going to basically go all the way till the election this semester. So, are we going to see like intensifying stuff on the campus, on the college campus side, or do you think on the contrary, the universities have sort of like figured it out? They're gonna know how to tamp things down. The congressional hearings are going to be a little bit, a warning sign to them, and things will be more under control.
Well, I think that so many university presidents getting kicked out for just openly allowing anti Semitism and responding to this stuff badly, that's really good. And I'm
Hmm.
really happy that happened. Power respects threats to its power. And I think a lot of people understand there's going to be accountability if you look the other way at
Yeah,
this horror stuff happening. I think on college campuses, what I can tell you as a Democratic operative is the polls that I see.
yeah,
Young women are so focused on lack of access to abortion and bodily autonomy
right.
that they're just, I'm sorry, Palestine, I can show you the polls. It's just not even a rounding error about what they care about. It's abortion,
Huh.
and not
Interesting.
even democracy matters as much as abortion, which is crazy.
Wow.
And I think the young men on campus, generally speaking, they're more on the side of Trump. So it's more of a gender war. So I think what I would predict we'll see in the next 2 months would be more of a straight left versus right presidential election rather than some more of these toxic anti-Israel politics. So I'm
Interesting.
very encouraged by that.
Yeah. I mean, I guess one thing that, from my experience, is that it all depends on how intense things are going to be in Israel. What we see in Israel is that when there's a intense event in Israel, that's going to force things to erupt across the globe.
Sure.
Um, One last question, and then we can, wrap up. Similar question to the kind of vibes going on within the Democratic Party and the progressive movement in general. One of the things that I think began happening recently that I saw on Twitter, probably like copying over from TikTok, is this disillusionment of some people from the black community with a Palestinian with a call for like supporting Hamas, etc. I began seeing some of these like videos where where people from the black community were saying, "Oh, actually, you're not really for us. You're actually working against us." Maybe they're connecting it to illegal immigration. I'm not sure exactly where, Do you also see that? Is that really a thing, or is it
Yep.
just on the fringe and people are blowing it up?
No, no, no. Something I think actually Jewish people and LGBT people could take a note from the Black community is, look, they will work with other groups if they're marginalized. They're generally on their side. But when it comes to going after stuff they care about, they do not F around on this, okay?
Hmm.
So if they have an opportunity to get a president into office that understands like structural racism in this country, is interested in like addressing the historic issues with home ownership for the black community, they are not going to F around on Palestine. And I can
Yeah,
show you polls that prove this is true. So,
very interesting.
I've thought about this a lot. Like, I think it's okay for people to look after number one, right? And to say, if your group is against us, my support of you does not extend when you're
Yeah,
asking me to slit my own throat. So,
right, right.
yeah, I think that's a lesson many of us could learn.
Yeah, I think that Jews are not as good at that, but I think
Yeah,
October 7th pushed them, a lot of them, to the edge where it was like obvious that they had to make that stand.
sure.
Um,
If we've got a few
yeah.
minutes, I guess, can I ask you a few questions?
Oh, sure, sure. I was just trying to respect your time
No, no,
limitations, but
no.
I would love to. We can stay
So
another hour and a half here just talking to me. That's
I would
fine.
love to know. You see my Twitter from like a drastically more informed perspective than I do, right? And I've been very open about having been undereducated on these issues before October 7th. And I guess I would ask, like, am I doing a good job trying to
Hmm.
like educate people on these issues or point them in the right directions? Do I have some blind spot from your point of view with my analysis and how I kind of talk about these issues?
So, first of all, I hadn't thought about that before I came to the, to the conversation. So, offline, I'll be more than happy to comment to you, if I see anything like that and write to
Sure.
you, like, DM you, etc. So you know. Um, I will say that part of what I mean, maybe the word enjoyed is a little bit too strong, but what I've enjoyed watching is enjoying your process,
Yeah.
meaning enjoying your learning about it. So many good things happen when people open up to learning, from first sources, go directly to the source, read up, really try to understand. Again, that was sort of the whole theme of my first season of my podcast, right? So I think that you're doing a great job in the process you're doing. I think one thing I'll say to people abroad, like in America about this is, I think, and this is the thing that not only people in America but also people in Israel on the left don't understand about the right in Israel. There is, Israel doesn't have term limits for a whole bunch of reasons. Um, and so Netanyahu has been in power for many, many years,
Yes.
many, many years, right? It's actually pretty funny because there's a video of him in the first time that he ran for office, or first time he ran for to be the prime minister, where he said, "I will pass term limits in my term because I don't need more than two terms." Okay, he said that. Okay, he never did that, but he said that. So it's very funny in that sense, and um, it's given him time to accumulate a lot of enemies as well, and people that can't stand him. There's like this, just a very strong emotional reaction to him. One of the things that people sort of completely disregard and forget, and I think on the left in Israel especially, is that the only reason Bibi keeps on being elected is because the left hasn't put forth impressive enough people that are willing to look beyond their own, let's say, cohort, beyond their own, communities and groups that they go to, and broaden their coalition. And there's a reason for this. I mean, again, I'm going to be putting this in like 2 seconds over here. A topic that we can expand on much more. But to some degree, if you look at Israel, we're really at a tipping point now from a demographic standpoint, from a ideological standpoint. Israel was founded by Mapai, which is a left-wing, party. Ben Gurion was the head of this party. They were the ones who led the country for 20 years without any competition with from any other party. And the left is slowly losing its hold on the majority. Okay, and that goes back to what I said before. We now have a fully right-wing coalition, right? 64 seats, fully right-wing. And that is only because the left in Israel hasn't found a way to open its eyes a bit and expand its message and become relevant to more parts of the country. I think what I'm trying to say is that the reason people vote for Bibi all the time is not because we all think that Bibi is the most amazing guy in the world. It's because those are the options that
Yeah,
were presented, and that's what we vote for.
that makes a lot of sense. I guess I also wanted to ask, like, where do you think that, like, let's just assume that you guys finished the job, Hamas
Yep,
is eliminated, you
sure.
ignore the idiots here that want you to have the half measures, you go through, you assassinate, the leader that's hiding out, women's
Yeah,
clothes
Sinwar.
out
Yeah.
there somewhere. Let's just say you finished the job. What do you think the next decade looks like for Israeli security? Because I worry that if we don't, and this is one of the reasons I think our country should try to keep this relationship together, that I think Iran is going to continue destabilizing the Middle East. And I think it is going to make it more and more difficult for the United States to focus on threats that are more important to us, like China,
Yeah,
because we're going to find ourselves continually in this conflict. So,
right.
does that assessment of where things are going, does that make sense to you? Do you disagree with that? Like, how do you see the history of the
Yeah.
next 5, 10 years between our countries?
Wow. So there are so many moving parts. I feel like we're in this period in history where the entire world is shifting. I mean, you
Yeah,
see it in the elections in Europe and other things. So there's a lot of moving parts. So there, each one of them is like multiple scenarios depending on where it goes. I'd say, let me put it this way. Um, if the Democrats, refocus their energies in supporting the Abraham Accords rather
hmm,
than, continuing to, let's say, be, play nice with Iran. Let's imagine that, whoever's in power, right? Democrats, Trump, whatever, they decide to, okay, we got it that Iran is a force for terrorism, and we're gonna reorient ourselves, to support Israel. I would say that, if you put enough pressure on Iran, you can slow down what they're doing. Israel also has been preparing for an eventual attack to sabotage their, the nuclear efforts. And sometimes you could do that also without it being a war. I mean, I'm not sure if you know, but
sure.
one of the things that kept them back for years from being able to develop it was viruses that were
Yeah,
implanted in
Stuxnet.
their.
I love Stuxnet. When I ran for office, one of the main things I proposed was us like having the closest relationship with Israel over cyber warfare. I love
Yeah,
Stuxnet. I think y'all lead the world in this stuff as well as a bunch of other
yeah.
technology.
So
It's
there's
just
tons of ways of
brilliant.
doing it that doesn't trigger necessarily a huge war, right?
Yeah,
We could put the screws on that. The biggest question now is twofold. I'd say the smaller question is Hezbollah, because Hezbollah, is a
oof,
force we have to reckon with. It
yeah,
will be one way or another reckoned with. I'm not sure to what degree, but it will be. The bigger question, the real big question, and this is why Israel is so many times the one that's like at the tip of the questions that the West has to face. Okay, is, let's say we destroy Hamas. We have to create a better situation in the Gaza Strip. There are 1 million, 2 million people there that need to live. Right? We're not. No, we're not gonna deport them to to 1 million people to some other. I don't know.
sure.
That's not the plan. So there are only two options that I can see that lead to something peaceful. One option is that a not a some other Arab state, let's say the Emirates or whatever, help govern them, so that we have some sort of a buffer that's not Israeli, and slowly helps them, denazify them over time,
Yeah,
right? Education system, etc. Or if we can't arrange for that, and it's hard to do that, right? Then Israel is going to be in Gaza for a while. Now, whether or not we're in Gaza just militarily, that has its own disadvantages, or with settlements, that has its own disadvantages, right? Even if it's just for security reasons, there's security reasons to have settlements in places. Um, there's the question is going to be how long will it take for the world to forget what we've learned in October 7th?
yeah,
Because from our experience in Israel, the world forgets very, very fast. Okay. And then if the world will not forget, and realize that certain things are worse than us being in charge of, let's say, militarily in charge of that area, um, then we'll be okay. We can grow. The West will work together, and we'll see this as a lesser of all evils, and we can help distribute the humanitarian aid and help build things, as long as we're in control. And until we build a better community, a better denazified, version of the Gaza Strip.
That
If
is a
that's not the case,
non-trivial ask, I have to say. Like,
I know. If that's
woo!
not the case, we're talking about, it doesn't come across well in the media. It's going to be bad. There's going to be bad pictures all the time, and videos of things that are not good. It's the problem is, how do you live with the lesser of two evils, right?
Yeah.
That's really what we're dealing with. And if the West can remember that, then we'll be okay. And if not, it's going to be tough. It's going to be tough because we're always going to try and tread this weird little middle line, and it's going to cost us more pain than it would have if we would be more single-minded in like what we believe in.
I think that's well said.
Yeah. Brianna, this was amazing. Thank you so much for this conversation.
Of course. I'm very humbled that you asked me, and thanks for the opportunity to chat. It's like a lot of Americans, I think I get so focused on American politics. It's always good to check in with other countries, I think.
Yeah, yeah, and we'll be in touch after this, and we'll see how the viewers react, and from there we'll
Amazing.
take it to the next
Amazing.
step.
All right, I'm gonna go cook a lovely dinner. Thank you for having me. We'll talk soon.
Bye. Thank you so much.